Alright, picture this, it's 1780, the southern colonies are a hot mess, and the British think they're about to wrap up the American Revolution with a big old red bow. But then, in a twist that would make even a soap opera blush, the southern militia forces come out swinging with guerrilla tactics that redefine fighting dirty. And honestly, the British have no idea what hit them. The southern theater of the war was like your cousin's backyard during a July 4th barbecue gone wrong. Every loyalist, patriot, and neutral party in the colonies had a bone to pick. The British had marched down south, confident as ever, thinking they'd turn the colonies back into a neat extension of the crown. After all, they'd been cruising along, picking up strategic cities like Charleston and Savannah. But they didn't count on one crucial element: a scrappy network of local militias who were ready to make every forest, swamp, and dirt road a nightmare. Now, guerrilla warfare wasn't new. But these southern militias, they turned it into a near art form. You got Francis Marion, aka the Swamp Fox, a guy who knew the South's backwoods better than most people know the layout of their own house. Marion and his men would disappear into the swamp faster than you could say Redcoats, and pop up somewhere else to raid supplies, ambush small British detachments, or just remind the British that they couldn't relax anywhere south of Virginia. And Marion wasn't alone. Guys like Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens were making it clear the British might have guns and discipline, but the Patriots had a kind of chaotic genius strategy. The South didn't need traditional victories to mess with British morale. All they had to do was keep the British constantly paranoid. Now, let's talk about the genius behind this tactic. Conventional warfare? That was for the birds, at least as far as the southern militias were concerned. If the British were expecting orderly battles, the southern forces decided to give them total, unpredictable chaos instead. Imagine British soldiers expecting the usual volleys and cannon fire, only to have a scrappy band of militiamen appear out of nowhere, take a few shots, and then vanish. This was like the British expecting a well-choreographed ballet and instead getting a mosh pit. The southern forces would hit supply lines, destroy communication networks, and generally make a nuisance of themselves whenever and wherever they pleased. This wasn't about winning in the traditional sense, it was about survival and making British lives a living nightmare. The state militias swelled with every British misstep, every local insult, and every farm burned by the Redcoats. And pretty soon, the British realized they had a new war on their hands. So what do the British do? They start cracking down hard. They figure if they just flex their muscles, they can scare the militias back into line. Spoiler alert, this did not go as planned. Instead of intimidating the local populace, the British response just made the militias more popular. The British would roll into a town, take over, impose some martial law, maybe confiscate a few supplies, and leave with their heads high. But as soon as they turned their backs, those tamed townsfolk were sending letters to Francis Marion, letting him know exactly when and where to strike. Britain's heavy-handed tactics were about as effective as trying to put out a grease fire with water. They kept thinking they were getting control, but they were really just spreading the rebellion even more. By mid-1780, the British High Command was tearing its hair out, trying to figure out why the southern colonies were still such a mess. British troops were stretched thin, and the constant raids meant they were losing supplies faster than they could bring them in. Any British officer tasked with patrolling in the South had that look of a substitute teacher realizing their class was full of hyperactive pranksters. And for the Patriots, the growing success of guerrilla tactics was turning the war into a real home game. Even civilians who weren't ready to pick up arms were more than willing to pass on intelligence, hide militiamen, or refuse to sell supplies to British troops. The British military, well versed in orderly warfare, simply could not adapt to this moving target that didn't care about the rules. The beauty of the Southern Guerrilla Campaign was that it didn't even need a grand finale. It was like one long horror movie where the British couldn't find a door. By turning the southern colonies into a nightmare for British patrols, supplies, and morale, the militias effectively took over without a decisive battle. So when the British looked at the map and saw they controlled Charleston and Savannah, it might have seemed like they were winning. But in reality, the Patriot cause had won the hearts and minds of nearly everyone outside those British-controlled zones. Every minor skirmish was another psychological blow, another resource depleted, another reinforcement that the British were losing the war they thought they'd win so easily. By the end of 1780, the British were still trying to put a lid on the southern colonies, but it was more like trying to contain smoke. Every time they tried to push back against a militia leader like Marion or Sumter, the resistance spread. The morale of the British troops began to fray, and loyalist support, which had been so crucial to the British strategy, began to erode. It was one of the most ironic twists of the Revolution. Britain had come south hoping to secure their empire, but instead they found themselves in a never-ending game of hide-and-seek with militiamen who barely had 2 pennies to rub together but knew their territory like the back of their hand. In the end, the expansion of southern state militias and their guerrilla tactics became a template for unconventional warfare. These guys redefined how to fight a war when you don't have the resources but know the land and have sheer determination on your side. They made it clear that British victory wasn't inevitable and that even a superpower could be outmaneuvered by ingenuity and local support. The British learned the hard way that control of key cities didn't equal victory. What mattered was the people, the land, and the will of the southern militias who refused to play by the rulebook. This resistance only fueled the larger patriot cause, proving that the colonies wouldn't be put back under British rule without one heck of a fight. And there you have it. The southern militias turned the British campaign into a cautionary tale for anyone who thought controlling a country was as simple as planting a flag. They didn't need formal battles or massive armies. They just needed a willingness to make British lives miserable at every turn. And hey, they succeeded in epic style.